Hello again, everyone. Welcome to Washington Gun Law TV. I am Washington Gun Law President William Kirk. Thanks for joining us. Well, I hate to sound like a broken record, but the Biden administration has done it again. Now, I actually did this video about a week ago, and it got tangled up in Google jail, so I decided to pull it down. We're going to redo it. We're going to do it a little bit differently. But listen, I have had to do way too many videos about this president, how he just seems to be taking a collective dump on the criminal justice system. And I do take exception to it because I've been making my living in the criminal justice system since my late 20s. Listen, we already talked about the pardoning of his son, even though he said he wasn't going to do it. Then we had to talk about over 1,500 commutations in one day, the single biggest act of clemency ever. Then we had to talk about 37 of the 40 federal death row inmates having their sentences commuted. Don't even want to get started on the presidential medals of freedom. And it would almost seem like there really is nothing else they could do to thumb our nose at us. Unless, of course, I don't know, think of one of the most outrageous things you could think of. Like, I don't know, cut plea deals for the 9/11 terrorists. Well, guess what? That's exactly what they've done. Now, unlike all of their other work where they're really trying to brag about it, they're trying to distance themselves from it. We're going to connect the dots for you today so you can see that, nope, they have their fingerprints all over this absolutely atrocious act. So today, let's spend a few minutes and let's talk about one of the most atrocious acts of justice committed by this administration. Okay, America, I'm not joking when I say this, that yes, the 3 9/11 masterminds that are down in Guantanamo Bay, their lives have been spared by a plea bargain that will spare all 3 of their lives. They will spend the rest of their lives in prison. Now, the stories that we are going to rely upon for purposes of this story are all linked up down below. So if you want to connect the dots for yourself, if you want to geek out on it, if you want to challenge anything that we're claiming here, that is perfectly okay. All of the information we relied upon is down below in all of the stories linked up. Now, I mentioned earlier, I'm getting really frustrated about the fact that the president continues to just basically take a collective dump on the criminal justice system. And although on all of the other previous acts, the Biden administration was more than happy to tout their success and pat themselves on the back, on this one, they are actually trying to distance themselves. As a matter of fact, the Biden administration is claiming that they really had nothing to do with it whatsoever. Okay, now one quick caveat, and I think we all do need to be sensitive to this, is that if you take a look at all the stories I linked up down below, why a lot of us who may have not been directly impacted by September 11th, probably all are still screaming for vengeance. You need to understand that there are many 9/11 victim families, that is the surviving spouses and children and other family of people who were murdered that day, who candidly just want to bring some closure to this and close this chapter in their life. Now, there are others in that same segment who definitely want to see the ultimate penalty carried out on all 3 of these people. Okay, here's the issue. There are 3 Guantanamo Bay detainees whose now lives are spared, and you will recognize at least one or all of these names, and they include Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, Walid bin Attash, and Mustafa al-Hawsawi. Now, here's the big issue. You see, when all 3 of these terrorists were captured and sent to Guantanamo Bay, we got a lot of information out of them. However, we got a lot of that information out of them through the use of torture, okay? And I candidly have no problem with that because these were enemy combatants who were absolutely positively engaged in war against the United States of America. So much of the information that would be used to tie these individuals to this horrific act of terrorism is evidence that was obtained via torture. Now, if you take these 3 guys and you move them into the United States and you decide to try them into a United States district court, well, here's the thing. All of their defense attorneys, and rightfully so, would have significant constitutional objections to the admission of large chunks of evidence. Why? Because it's the product of torture. Now, here's the big deal, and this is the big rub here, okay, is that while all 3 of these terrorists are being detained in Guantanamo Bay, they are being prosecuted through a basically established out of thin air, almost a quasi-militaristic court that's operating really with no sets of rules. And so they kind of have the exclusive jurisdiction over what's going on here. And one of the reasons that a trial has not occurred more than 2 decades post 9/11 is because nobody can agree on what the procedural rules are of this made-up court. But as I mentioned, and this is what we're going to try to connect the dots on today, the Biden administration claims that they have absolutely No involvement in this at all. As a matter of fact, a spokesperson for the National Security Council specifically stated at the time that these plea deals were announced, President Biden and the White House played no role in approving the settlements and only learned of them when they were announced by the Pentagon. Okay, so is that true? Well, we need to take a look at all of the players and how we got here, and then what connection any of them might have to the Biden administration. Okay, the players in this thing are the chief prosecutor, who is Rear Admiral Aaron C. Rue. Admiral Rue was appointed to that position in 2022 by Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. Okay, which would be right in the middle of the Biden administration. And by the way, he was appointed to that position in early 2022, and I want you to keep that in the back of your head. Who else played a role in this? That would be the judge, who is retired Brigadier General Susan Escalier, who was also appointed in 2022 by Lloyd Austin. Okay, so the judge was appointed to that position right in the middle of the Biden administration. And as you can see, the one name that continues to pop up is Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, who, as we know, is President Joe Biden's Secretary of Defense. So the only three names that really come into play in this equation are all there because of the Biden administration. Now, a couple of important dates, because we're just trying to connect dots here, right? According to the stories below, plea negotiations began in March of 2022, and plea deals were reached in July of 2024. So plea negotiations began shortly after Admiral Rue took over as the prosecutor, and General Escalier actually took over as the judge. And then plea negotiations were concluded, that is, plea deals were reached in July of 2024, about the same time that President Biden was making the choice not to run for re-election. Now, here's what else happened, is the Biden administration was more than happy to just let this thing get swept under the rug with no attention until the New York Post jumped all over it with this story right here. Once that happened, well, then Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin went into full damage control mode. And what he attempted to do was to remove the judge and to withdraw all of those plea deals, which is a move he actually took, which was actually met by considerable support, especially from those that have a tendency to be on our side of the political aisle. But here's the deal. The attorney for the three terrorists, they appealed that. And who do they appeal it to? Because you're not going to send that back over into the United States Court of Appeals, because then you're going to have to start applying all sorts of actual constitutional standards here, right? So the appeal is held by the same made-up military court, who then rules that Secretary of Defense Austin had no authority to step in and remove the judge, had no authority whatsoever to withdraw the plea deals. There is an actual plausible argument that that is all correct when you take a look at how the court was set up out of thin air. And so the ruling now is that the plea deals that were reached with these three terrorists to spare them their lives are final. And that there is no other appealing. And candidly, you can't drag this over to the United States Court of Appeals, because you're going to open up a whole nother can of worms. But when the president wants to say that they had nothing to do with this whatsoever, that this was done completely independent of the administration, let us remember that every single person who has fingerprints on this complete travesty of justice are Biden appointees. And let us also remember that this entire process, from beginning to end, occurred exclusively during the Biden administration. And I want you to remember one other thing, America, because when we did this video right here and talked about the 37 of the 40 federal death row inmates that had their sentences commuted, the sole factor by which President Biden claims to have left 3 of those individuals on death row was because their crimes were motivated by racial bias and or hate. And I would then ask this administration, what do you think the entire 9/11 attack was motivated by? So at the end of the day, President Biden, you and your administration can claim all you want that you had nothing to do with it, but your administration is the only one with fingerprints all over it. Listen, like I said, all the stories we relied upon are going to be linked up down below so that you guys can geek out and connect the dots for yourself. If you got any other questions about this or anything else related to what's left of your Second Amendment rights, you guys should know how to get a hold of Washington gun law by now. But if you don't, that's okay. That information is down there in the description box. If you got an idea for a video we should be doing around here, all you got to do is click on that link right there and tell us all about it. If you want to subscribe to our monthly newsletter, the ability to do all of that is down there in the description box. And then finally, and most importantly, let's remember that part of being the lawful and responsible gun owner, like we talk about all the time here, is to know what the law is in every situation, how it applies to you in any instance that you may find yourself. Until next time, thanks for watching and stay safe.